Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today, back on the show for part 2, Dr. Kenny is with us, and she brings with her a knowledge that just is unsurpassed in this industry. Dr. Kenny is going to educate not only myself and all of our viewers at home, but I think she's got a few things that are going to help John Euler along the way today, too, and I'm pretty sure that he'll have a little bit bigger vocabulary by the time he's finished this episode as well. John, welcome back. Dr. Kenny, welcome back. And thank you both for being here today.
Brad, thank you as always. And I recommend people go and visit episode 1 if you have not yet. That'll bring you up to speed on what we're going to talk about. We're going to jump into a number of things. Dr. Kenny is a subject matter expert in a lot of different areas dealing with the trans movement, really as we are unmasking the trans movement. In between episodes, as we had a chance to talk, I learned, and so we're going to talk about for a moment here. Dr. Kenny also has a background, like I do, in working with those that have sexually offended against other people, especially kids. And she's worked with adolescents or minors that have perpetrated sexual offenses. And that is so pertinent because as she and I were talking, she also has the same kind of concerns that I do, that not only are financial predators that are allowing kids to have quote unquote skin in the game, and they're exploiting very vulnerable kids. They're doing surgeries that they never should be doing on these kids. But this entire movement dumbs down the ability for adults that should know better, especially mandated reporters, to be able to meaningfully spot and identify kids that are being groomed and exploited and abused, and being able to identify those that are showing signs of being predators. So we're not able to help those kids that are being exploited and harmed and having their sexual boundaries violated, as well as those that pose a threat. Dr. Kenny, welcome back. And let's talk about this because this is so crucial. We talked about Drag Queen Story Hour, and now we've got kids that are being brought into the drag kids where, as you said, and I totally agree, that pedophiles, right? If you show an undue interest in a child's sex and sexuality, it's up to you to prove that you're not a pedophile. And they're handing money to these kids. Let's talk about this because it's so important. Then we're going to talk about some of the other aspects of the trans movement that we have concerns about. But speak to us about your concerns that this movement is allowing dangerous men, sexual predators, to have access to vulnerable kids.
So you mean the drag queen movement?
Correct. Men that show clear signs of having accessed pornography, and also speak to your concerns about how pornography underlies a lot of this entire thing that we're dealing with.
Yeah, look, there's been a surgence of, the drag queen, which, up until recently has been quite a encapsulated part of society, that there are people who dress in drag and people who go to see the people dressed in drag. But it wasn't ever as publicly displayed as it is now. And one of the ways that the drag queen proponents have infiltrated mainstream society is through this drag queen story hour. I don't know if you have it in the States where...
we sure do, but for those that don't know, go ahead and describe that.
Yeah, it's where drag queens are brought into very young children's faces, like public libraries and preschools and childcare centres. And under the guise of these drag queens reading stories to children, there's this kind of sinister underlying message that is trying to attract children into that subculture. And unfortunately, the whole movement of the drag queens being integrated into mainstream society, they misapprehend the developmental processes of gender formation in children. And they claim that they're trying to capture what they call the gender fluidity of childhood. And in fact, the reverse is true. Children are very rigidly gendered in the early part of the lifespan, and they remain so until they achieve what we call gender constancy. That is, that they're still boys or girls, regardless of how short or long their hair is or what colour clothes they're wearing. So, you know, a 2-year-old will say that they're a girl, and then if you ask them how they know, they'll say, because I've got my pretty pink dress on. It's not until about between 4 and 7 that children develop a first sense of gender constancy. And it's only after that time that they become more flexible in their gender expression. So this drag queen story hour risks confusing preschool children about the normative perceptual markers of biological sex. And that could have long-term ramifications about their gender identity and expression. And there are some case studies of people who've been actually cross-dressed as children, not because they've asked to be, but because their parents had some peccadillo or another, or some cultural imperative where they wanted to dress their little boys as girls, for example. And I've seen some of these people in therapy, and they're some of the saddest, most depressed individuals you'll ever meet. You know, they've just got all these unresolved issues about why their parents did that to them, and they remain confused regarding their gender identity right into adulthood. And a very public example of that is Walt Heyer, who was dressed as a girl by his, I think, mother as a child, and he became extremely gender confused and has remained so, to the point where he actually transitioned you know, medically transitioned with the hormones and so forth, and then realised that he was a male and transitioned back, but then couldn't settle into a male identity and retransitioned into a female again. And he's done that throughout his life. And he's set up a webpage now, you know, to warn young people about, you know, the whole gender vulture. Instead, I say gender vulture instead of culture, because that's what it is. And it's to warn young people about the devastating effects that being or enacting cross-genderism in early childhood and youth can have long-term impacts. And I think his website gets about 25,000 hits a month. So, I mean, I've seen posters that encourage children, and I quote, to show off their inner drag queen in training. So instead of it being a very benign process of reading storybooks to children, we find this sort of, you know, subterranean culture of recruitment of young children into that culture. And just recently we've seen, not in the same way as we've seen in the exponential increase in the number of young people declaring themselves transgender, but an increasing number of young people who are dressing in drag. And a number of them have significant internet profiles, and they're performing in adult venues. And these young people are having their minders, or whoever they are, posting highly sexualized images of themselves on the internet. And they're 8, 9, 10 years of age. So that's another very concerning development socially that I've observed in the past few years.
A huge part of my concern is that under the guise of trans movement, and especially as we're suddenly focusing on sexually deviant men that are clearly accessing pornography. Now, again, is every drag queen is a predator? No, right? Because as long as they're staying around adults, they can do what they want to do. But when they get around kids, right? There's even adult drag queens that are very clear in saying that no man dressed like that should be around kids. From your perspective, how much of a concern is it as far as the possibility that there are pedophiles, there are child sexual predators among those men that are clearly sexualized, clearly acting in a sexually provocative manner, trying to access kids? How potentially dangerous is that?
Look, it's not just, the pedophiles are not just in the drag queen industry or the audience of the drag queens. A few years ago, we had a royal commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And the information that came out of that was truly disheartening, that every institution from every faith, from Catholicism to the Salvation Army to, Protestant institutions, rampant child sexual abuse among priests and ministers and pastors, and you find it in, the teaching profession, you find it in the Scout movement. So the diaspora of, pedophilic behaviour is very, very broad. And so we need to be careful, in thinking that it's really just located in a few circumscribed venues that most people don't frequent. And sadly, parents have trusted their children in these institutions. Of course, the children who didn't have parents, children who were orphaned or abandoned, were very easy targets for sexual predators in these other types of institutions, as well as in the overtly, sexual subcultures that we've just been talking about.
And that's so well put. As a matter of fact, my very first website, a training site, is called churchprotect.org. So my primary concern are churches. The predators, the most sophisticated of pedophiles, will actually target churches. So I tell people the two realms, two worlds that I'm most concerned about are churches and the trans movement that make the easiest target. But a pedophile will target any kid anywhere, especially in the foster care system. So many of the kids that are being transitioned medically come out of the foster care system. They have been previously sexually abused. Many of them are autistic. So both of those two groups have a very difficult time with their intuition, and therefore they make easy targets. As someone is crossing their sexual boundaries, that young person has a hard time kind of really being sure of what's going on. And then, of course, the predator will say, well, I know what it looks like, but it's really not that. So it sets them up for being easy targets. So pornography, right, is being used. Predators will use pornography in one way or the other to influence, to begin to script the mind of kids, to try to normalize things. We have SOGI sex ed, sexual orientation and gender identity, that's being pumped into the schools. Speak to your concerns about pornography as it pertains to the trans movement and the grooming of kids.
I don't have a lot of information on that relationship. It would be interesting to know more about it, but my experience doesn't really include grooming from pedophiles. The experience that I've had is more gender ideologues, who have got a barrow to push, a psychopathological barrow. And some of, these people who are such agents for the trans movement are so clearly psychologically unwell that our hands are full, really, trying to counter the influence of these, what we call trans influencers, these people of influence, and they influence, people around them, and people around them influence other people. And that's how, their tentacles have spread throughout the whole of society. Now, how, the pedophilic kind of subgroup fits into that, I'm not sure.
You have called the trans movement the greatest medical scandal that has swept into not just youth culture, but into countries around the world. We touched on it in part one. Let's again talk about your concerns. And this is so important for parents and others to understand. So speak to why you use those terms. Those are very powerful terms when you say it's the greatest medical scandal of our century.
Yeah, well, I think, we could possibly compare it to lobotomies that were one of the great medical scandals of last century, where, people with mental illness were having parts of their frontal lobe removed using an ice pick through the eye, which is horrifying to think of now, and operation, including, I believe, one of the daughters of Joseph Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy, the former president of the United States. And the surgeon who developed this technique actually won a Nobel Prize until finally, it was recognised that it had absolutely no medical merit or psychiatric merit whatsoever. We have another medical scandal, which is called narcolepsy therapy, where people were put into very deep states of coma, and many of them died because the human body can't cope with that kind of interference. And I'm not being sensationalist when I compare the medical intervention of what's going on with children who are undergoing the euphemistically expressed phrase gender affirmation, where they're having their puberty stopped, where they're being pumped full of a cross-sex hormone that their body is not geared to tolerate. And then, very sadly, many of them are undergoing particular forms of mutilating surgery. The most common of which is the double mastectomy. But we've also got the genital surgeries, the phalloplasties and the vaginoplasties and the sigmoidectomies and so forth, where young people are turning up 2 and 3 years later to the surgeon saying, I made a mistake, I want my penis back, or I've made a mistake, I want my breasts back. So these children clearly haven't understood the irreversibility of the procedures to which these doctors think that they've consented, because, going back and asking for a reversal is absolute evidence that they did not have any understanding of what they were doing at the time. And so there's two things. Obviously do no harm. And secondly, to make these kinds of decisions at a very young stage of the lifespan is utterly and unforgivably irresponsible. And yet surgeons are making a specialty of what they call, sex reassignment surgery or gender affirmation surgery. And they're advertising and boasting about how many they've performed in a particular period of time. And I think one particular surgeon who is now recommending caution about surgeries for young people declaring themselves transgender, has performed 2,000 of these surgeries before realising that it's a very bad thing to do. But I've never seen her once apologise to those 2,000 young people whose lives she has irreparably destroyed by her technical skill as a surgeon in removing their genitalia.
It truly is surreal. And what you have emphasized is what I also emphasized. And this really speaks to part of the huge concern about what's being called conversion therapy and therefore anti-conversion therapy laws in this sense. First of all, they capture the language, those you've referenced, very cult-like. I concur on part one, that the trans movement will suck these kids in. It's recruitment and retention to get them on the moving sidewalk of the trans movement, which will sterilize and then eventually amputate as it dumps them out onto a surgeon's gurney. So the cults and cult leaders and manipulators push, they will all play with language. Because if you can play with language, you play with the conceptual ideas of what people understand. So if you call it conversion therapy, it seems like we are, somebody that is practicing that. I don't know anybody that practices conversion therapy, because we're not out to change anybody into our image, so to speak. But the trans cult, as it divides and separates families, they will draw that child in, and as it were, they will take possession. They draw it into the community, into the family, into the movement, and they, in essence, hold a hand up and say, parents, keep your hands off our child. If anybody tries to then, in a way, if the child comes out of the cult leaders, those in the trans movement, say, somebody has converted our child. So this term, it's such a slick flipping of the script. So a lot of countries now have passed legislation. So I say, we're not here to convert anybody, but I do believe that therapists and others in the people helping profession have a responsibility to ensure two things. One is child protection. So we are mandated reporters. So we need to be able to be educated enough and discerning enough to spot the warning signs of potential exploitation or abuse. Young adolescent saying, I wish I wasn't a girl. I hate being a girl. I wish I was a boy. The problem with the trans movement is they have caused mandated reporters to reframe the red flags of possible abuse into gender-related matters, where that should be the very first thing. If you have a young person say, I hate being who I am, I wish I was the opposite sex, in my estimation, a mandated reporter better be wise enough and discerning enough to ask a follow-up question. But the second piece is equally as concerning, and you spoke to that. So it's making sure that mandated reporters can adequately do their job. We don't have to investigate, but at least ask enough questions to discern so we can protect. The other is the young person being given adequate information that they can comprehend and apprehend so that they can make a fully informed decision or informed consent? You just referenced that there is right now, with this fast tracking of these kids, there is no way these kids, they can't comprehend. Nobody's showing them pictures of, oh, this is what you may look like. These are the harms a few years from now, potentially. Are you really understanding this? You just spoke to that. Once again, speak to your concerns about how these kids are not able at a young age to, especially, they may be late teens, but if they are sexual abuse victims, if they have psychodynamic issues going on, they're not going to be able to process. They may be in a state of dissociation.
Well, look, you've made two separate points there, and the first one relating to conversion therapy, which I think is the biggest red herring and the biggest distractor in the debate. And I've argued in front of several parliaments in this country that it is a ploy, to redirect attention away from the real issue. The trans lobby has produced these phony reports from people who had undergone so-called conversion therapy, but they were 50 and 60 years of age. They couldn't, find a single case of somebody, who was a teenager or in their early 20s. And conversion therapy back then was about, becoming straight if you're a gay person. And it was only practiced by fringe religious groups, fundamentalist groups and extremist groups. And yes, it did a huge amount of damage to some of the people in the gay community. But this is what the trans lobby is very clever at, appropriating the issues that belong to other groups and adopting them as their own issue. And conversion therapy is one. And so they tried to argue in several states in Australia that any therapist who was not gender affirming, immediately the child walked through the door, was practicing conversion therapy. And in fact, it's been outlawed in 3 or 4 states in this country. So therapists are too terrified to engage in exploratory psychotherapy now, for fear that they'll face jail and huge monetary fines, which of course it's almost never going to be provable. The legislation is appalling. The wording is ambiguous and inconsistent and unclear. And, how on earth you're ever going to uphold that legislation in a court of law defies my belief. But it's just another scare tactic that the trans lobby has used to terrify people into submission and silence. So I think the conversion therapy issue is just a massive red herring. It's just had far too much press. And the conversion therapy is actually gender affirmation, because the gender affirmation people are saying there's only one way. If the child says they're trans, well, then they're trans, and you have to do everything you can to transition them before they've had any opportunity to think it through. That's conversion therapy, not the open-ended exploratory psychotherapy, pardon me, and family therapy that responsible therapists are undertaking to help the young person and the family explore, the issues as to how this young person has come to the point in their lives such that they feel that they're transgender. And we have to remember time and place. This is a feature of the youth of this generation. It has never been a feature of the youth of any previous generation, to my knowledge. And so we have to assign a very important role to social contagion. And the way that the lobby has ingratiated itself so successfully into all our public institutions. I mean, we don't have public institutions supporting children who say they're suicidal. There's no public institution that would say, oh, you're suicidal, you really want to die? Well, we're not going to stand in the way. That's your right. That's your deeply held view about the quality of your life right now. So please do whatever you need to do, up to and including committing suicide. We're not going to use our public institutions to allow a child with anorexia nervosa to starve herself to death, because that's her deeply held view that she's worthless and doesn't deserve to eat, or that she's obese when she's actually, fading away. So there are none of these other issues that trouble adolescents, like substance abuse, non-suicidal self-injury, marijuana and cigarette smoking. Our social institutions don't go ahead and say, well, you're of the age of consent at 12, of course you can smoke cigarettes, or of course you can go off and vape with your friends behind the sporting block at school and not go to your classes. Transgenderism is the only adolescent difficulty that has the imprimatur of our social institutions. And we have to ask ourselves, how did that come about? And why has that come about? And what are we going to do about it?
Dr. Kenny, in closing, I can't help but ask you to reference, because one key piece, so before we close in about a minute or two, would you reference the study that has come out of Europe? I want to say Sweden, is it? Or Norway? That they have found that the suicide rate post-surgery is actually much higher. So instead of, listen, do you want a live daughter or a dead, we were all, so speak to that in about a minute, just so parents are aware that what we're hearing, new information is coming out.
Yes, well, there's old information as well. And to my knowledge, the only robust longitudinal study of transgender individuals up to 20 years after they've transitioned, and these are all adults. And what that study found was that the suicide rate after transition was 19 times higher than the general population matched for age and sex. And so the other myth that is being perpetrated is that suicide and suicide rates are not higher in children who are declaring themselves transgender compared with young people in the general population. And a study coming out of the UK by Michael Biggs very recently, I think 2021, showed that there had been 4 suicides in 15,000 young transgender declaring people, which is quite a lot lower than the general adolescent population of the same age and distribution, sex distribution. So there are a lot of myths being perpetrated by the trans lobby that we really need to debunk as quickly as possible. And there are 2 of them. The post-surgery suicide rate is massively higher, and the declaration rate of transgendered young people, the suicide rate is at or less than the general adolescent population. Blackmailed into allowing their child to transgender because they fear that they're going to lose their child altogether. So parents really need to be given the message that that is not the case.
Right, and that's exactly what this is. This is emotional blackmail that's happening to parents. Parents are fearful. They trust the medical professionals or the psychological professionals that are working with these young people. And in a time of crisis, what is suggested but life-altering medical procedures that if you simply allow a child to work through those issues, they will get over that the vast majority of the time, so that they won't be left with lifelong additional physical and emotional and mental scars. So, Dr. Kenny, thank you so much. You are a wealth of information, and we will have you back. Appreciate it so much. Brad, thank you as always.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Kenny. We enjoyed that episode immensely, both of them, for that matter. If you missed part 1, please go back to part 1. There is so much to see. Unmaskingthetransmovement.com is our website. All of our episodes are there. Please stop in, like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to see our BitChute channel as well, which is up and underway, where you can actually throw in a comment and hear back from some of our experts. I'm Brad Wilder. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. We'll see you next time.